The night was dark, heavy with storm clouds. Rain poured from the sky, hitting the tin roof of the old barn. The wind howled across the empty fields, rattling broken windows and bending the tall grass outside. Inside the farmhouse, a lonely man sat by the fire. His name was Thomas, a simple farmer who had lived alone for many years. His wife was gone, his children grown, and his land was quiet, too quiet most days. But tonight was different. Tonight he felt something was wrong. A faint sound carried through the storm. It was not the sound of wind, not the sound of rain. It was softer, broken, almost like crying. Thomas froze, listening. The sound came again, carried from the direction of his barn. He reached for his lantern, the old kind that glowed with fire instead of light bulbs, and stepped out into the night. The storm soaked his coat instantly, cold water running down his face. He moved quickly across the muddy yard, boots sinking into wet earth. The barn stood tall but old, its wooden doors creaking in the wind. He pushed them open slowly, the lantern light spilling into the dark space. At first he saw nothing but shadows and hay. The place smelled of damp straw and old wood. His animals had been sold long ago. The barn was nearly empty now. But then he heard it again, the sound, weak and broken. It came from the far corner. Thomas lifted his lantern higher, his heart beating faster. In the corner, half hidden under hay and dirt, something moved. He stepped closer, careful and slow. At first he thought it was an injured animal. But as the light fell on the figure, his breath caught in his chest. It was not an animal. It was a girl. Her body was thin, her skin pale with strange blue lines glowing faintly beneath the surface. Her clothes were torn, covered in mud and blood. She trembled as the light touched her, pulling herself back against the wall as if she expected him to strike her. Her eyes, large and shining, not like human eyes, glowed faintly in the dark. They were full of fear, but also something else, exhaustion. Thomas stood frozen, an alien. He had heard stories, whispers of strange beings crossing the skies, but he had never seen one. And now one was here in his barn, broken and afraid. The girl pressed herself harder into the wall, breathing fast. Her arms shook as she tried to lift them, but she was too weak. She looked at him as if waiting for death. Slowly, Thomas set the lantern down on the floor. He raised his empty hands, showing her he meant no harm. "Easy," he said softly. His voice was rough from years of working the land, but gentle now. "I won't hurt you." She didn't understand his words. He could see that in her frightened eyes. But she understood his hands, his calm tone, his slow steps. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small canteen of water. He set it on the ground and pushed it toward her. For a long moment, she did not move. Then, with shaking hands, she reached for it. She lifted it to her lips and drank, spilling some as her strength failed her. But she drank deeply, as if she had not tasted water in days. Thomas knelt down a few feet away, not too close to scare her, but near enough to show he would not run. His lantern glowed between them, lighting her broken figure. Her arms were covered in strange marks, burns, cuts, scars that looked like they came from chains or experiments. He frowned, anger flickering in his chest. Who would do this to a living being? Outside, thunder rolled louder than before. A flash of light filled the barn for a moment. The girl flinched, clutching the canteen tightly. Thomas looked toward the open door, then back at her. He realized something terrible. She was not just hiding from the storm. She was hiding from something else. Her eyes darted to the sky with every sound. She shook her head weakly and whispered a word he did not understand. It sounded broken, full of pain, but clear enough for him to know it was a warning. Thomas's heart beat faster. Who was she running from? And what would happen if they came here, to his farm, to his barn? He felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. He could chase her away, close the doors, and pretend he never saw her. That would be the safe choice. But something inside him would not allow it. She was broken, helpless, and afraid, and he was the only one who had found her. The rain grew heavier, hammering the barn roof. In the distance, a strange hum carried through the storm. Not thunder, not wind. Something else. Something unnatural. The girl's glowing eyes widened. She clutched the canteen close to her chest and whispered again, this time with more fear. "They come." Thomas froze, staring at her. His lantern flickered. The storm roared outside. And in that moment he understood. Whatever hunted her was not far, and now it might be coming for him too. The storm raged outside, shaking the old barn. Rain struck the roof like drums of war, and the wind whistled through broken boards. Thomas sat on his knees, his lantern light flickering between him and the strange alien girl. She was still curled in the corner, trembling, clutching the canteen to her chest as if it was her last hope. Her glowing eyes stared at him with suspicion, though the water he gave her had calmed her breathing. She looked young, perhaps no older than a human teenager, yet her face carried the weight of endless suffering. Thomas could see that she was close to collapse. He knew she needed more than water. She needed warmth, food, and safety. He hesitated, torn between fear and compassion. He was just a farmer, a simple man with no weapon, no army, no power. But as he looked at her broken figure, he felt something stir inside him. A voice he had not heard in years whispered, "Help her." Slowly he rose and left the barn, the storm soaking him as he ran to his farmhouse. Inside he grabbed a loaf of bread, an old blanket, and some dried meat. His hands shook as he hurried back to the barn, his lantern swinging wildly in the wind. When he stepped inside, she flinched again, pressing her back against the wall. Her glowing eyes narrowed as if ready for pain, but Thomas only placed the food on the ground, then spread the blanket near her. He sat across from her, silent, waiting. Minutes passed before she dared to move. Hunger finally broke her fear. She reached for the bread with shaking fingers, tearing small pieces and eating quickly, almost desperately. Thomas watched quietly, his chest tightening. No one should be this hungry. No one should be this afraid. She looked up at him once, her glowing eyes softer now, though still wary. She pointed at herself weakly and said a word, strange, heavy, broken. It sounded like her name, though Thomas could not understand it. He tried repeating it, fumbling the sound, and she tilted her head, almost amused. For a moment the fear faded, replaced by something fragile. Then a sudden flash of light cut through the barn window. Not lightning. This was sharper, controlled like the beam of a searchlight. Thomas's breath caught. He moved quickly to blow out his lantern, plunging them into darkness. The barn filled with only the sound of rain and the faint glow of her alien eyes. She pressed her hand to her chest and whispered again, "They come." Her voice cracked with fear. Thomas crouched low, crawling to the barn door. He peeked through a crack in the wood. His heart froze. Across the fields, in the storm, he saw shapes moving. Tall figures with helmets that glowed faintly. They carried weapons that pulsed with strange light. Searchlights swept across the land, scanning for something. Scanning for her. Thomas pulled back quickly, his hands trembling. He looked at the girl. She was staring at him, waiting for his choice. If he gave her up, maybe they would spare him. Maybe they would leave. But deep inside, Thomas knew. These were not men who spared lives. They were hunters. They would kill her and likely kill him too, just for helping. The girl tried to rise, but her body was too weak. She collapsed onto the blanket, groaning softly. Thomas moved without thinking. He grabbed loose hay and spread it quickly, covering her body. She looked up at him, confused, but then she understood. He was hiding her, protecting her. The heavy sound of boots came closer. Thomas's breath came fast. The barn doors shook as someone pounded on them. A deep mechanical voice shouted through the storm, "Open now." Thomas swallowed hard. His heart raced. He thought of running, of denying her, of saving himself. But when he looked at the hay pile, where her glowing eyes still peeked faintly, something inside him hardened. He could not betray her. He opened the door slowly, lantern in hand, pretending to look calm. 3 armored soldiers stood before him, rain dripping from their black suits. Their helmets hissed with strange blue lights, their weapons glowing faintly in the storm. One soldier stepped forward. His voice was cold, sharp, and commanding. "Have you seen anything unusual tonight?" Thomas forced his voice steady. "Only the storm. Nothing else." The soldier's visor glowed brighter, scanning him. Another walked past, stepping inside the barn. Thomas's stomach twisted. The soldier's light swept over the hay, the walls, the empty stalls. For a moment the beam lingered on the pile where she hid. Thomas clenched his fists. His whole life balanced on this moment. One wrong move, one wrong breath, and they would kill them both. Finally, the soldier lowered his light and turned back. "Nothing here," he said. The leader stared at Thomas for a long moment, as if trying to see through his soul. Then, without another word, they turned and disappeared into the storm. Their footsteps faded into the rain, their searchlights drifting away. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding. When he finally turned back, the girl was pulling herself from the hay. Her glowing eyes were fixed on him, not with fear now, but with something else. Trust. For the first time since he found her, she whispered a word he could almost understand. It was soft, weak, but clear. Safe. And in that moment, Thomas realized something dangerous. He had chosen her side. He had chosen kindness over fear, and now, there was no turning back. The storm faded slowly as dawn crept across the land. The first rays of sunlight broke through heavy clouds, painting the wet fields in a dull golden glow. Inside the barn, Thomas sat against a wooden beam, exhausted but unable to rest. His mind replayed the night again and again, the soldiers, the lies, the danger, and above all the alien girl who still lay curled in the blanket he had given her. She was asleep now, her breathing shallow but steady. Her glowing lines pulsed softly beneath her pale skin like veins of living light. Thomas stared at her in silence. He had lived a long, simple life, one of crops, soil, and sweat. He had buried dreams with his wife long ago. Yet now, in his barn, lay proof that the universe was far stranger than he ever believed. When she stirred, Thomas straightened. Her eyes opened slowly, glowing faintly even in daylight. She sat up weakly, clutching the blanket closer. For a long moment, neither spoke. She looked at him with caution, then touched her chest lightly. She whispered the strange word again, her name. Thomas tried to repeat it. His tongue stumbled, the sound harsh compared to her soft voice. She tilted her head, then gave a faint smile. It was small, fragile, but real. Thomas felt something stir inside him, a warmth he had not known for years. He pointed at himself. "Thomas," he said, tapping his chest. Then he pointed at her, repeating her name slowly. She nodded, her smile trembling at the edges. It was the first bridge between their worlds, but the moment of calm did not last. She shifted the blanket, and Thomas saw the scars again. Strange burns circled her arms and wrists as if chains of fire had bound her. Her back carried marks of whips, and across her shoulder was a wound still fresh, cut deep by something sharp and cruel. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, though he knew she would not understand. Still, she seemed to understand his eyes, his anger. She shook her head, then pointed toward the sky. With trembling fingers, she traced shapes in the air, forming circles and lines. Ships. He understood. Ships had brought her here. Her hands shook as she made more gestures, desperate to tell her story. She mimed being chained, dragged, struck. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered a word again and again. Thomas couldn't understand the language, but he could feel the meaning. She had been a prisoner. The realization burned inside him. Whoever those soldiers were, they were not guardians. They were hunters, enslavers. They had hurt her, broken her, and chased her to his land. His chest ached with pity and rage. The girl suddenly froze, her glowing eyes darting toward the barn wall. She crawled weakly to the wooden boards and pressed her ear against them. Thomas listened too. At first he heard nothing but the quiet drip of rain. Then, faint distant, came a low hum. Engines. Thomas's blood ran cold. They were still searching. The girl turned to him quickly, whispering a word, urgent and broken. "Hide." She pointed at him, then at herself. She shook her head violently, tears forming again. She did not want him caught in her danger. She wanted to leave, to protect him. But Thomas stepped forward, kneeling in front of her. He shook his head firmly. "No," he said. His voice was low, steady. He pointed at her wounds, then at himself. "Safe. Here." She stared at him, confused, but his tone and his eyes carried meaning beyond language. He would not abandon her. Suddenly, heavy footsteps sounded outside. Boots on wet ground. Thomas's heart hammered. The girl's glowing eyes went wide with terror. She tried to stand, but her legs failed. Thomas grabbed her shoulders gently and pulled her back into the hay. He covered her quickly, whispering, "Quiet." The barn doors creaked. Shadows fell inside. A beam of light swept across the floor, crawling over the wood, creeping toward the hay where she hid. Thomas stood tall, stepping into the light before it reached her. "Who's there?" a soldier's voice barked. Thomas tightened his grip on the lantern, though it was unlit. His mouth was dry, his heart pounding, but his voice came out steady. "Farmer," he said. "Barn's empty." The soldier's boots creaked as he stepped inside, light flashing across the stalls. Thomas held his ground, every muscle tight. If the soldier looked too closely, if he touched the hay, it would all be over. The beam lingered. The soldier seemed to hesitate. Then after a long pause, he grunted and turned away. Nothing here. When the boots faded, Thomas let out a long breath he didn't know he was holding. He dropped to his knees, pulling the hay away. The girl sat up, shaking, her eyes wide with disbelief. She reached out weakly, her hand brushing his arm. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Safe." The same word she had used last night, but this time it was different. This time it carried trust. Thomas looked at her glowing eyes and knew something had changed. Secrets still lay between them. Her past, her hunters, her power, but one truth was clear. She was not alone anymore, and neither was he. The sun was high by the time Thomas dared step out of the barn. The storm had passed, but the ground was wet and heavy with mud. Birds should have been singing after such rain, yet the fields were strangely silent. The silence unsettled him. It was the silence of fear, as if even the land knew something was wrong. Inside the barn, the alien girl sat weakly, her back against the wall. She was stronger than the night before, but still pale, her glowing lines dim with exhaustion. Thomas placed a bowl of warm broth beside her, made from the little he had left in his kitchen. She touched it carefully, then looked up at him with quiet gratitude. For a brief moment, Thomas allowed himself to hope. Maybe the soldiers had left. Maybe they believed his lie. Maybe she could heal here and he could protect her in secret. But that fragile hope shattered when a sound rolled across the fields. Engines. Not one. Many. Thomas rushed to the barn doors and peeked outside. His heart sank. Black armored ships were landing in the far meadow, their thrusters bending the grass flat, mud spraying as the metal beasts settled on the earth. Soldiers poured out, dark figures with glowing visors and weapons that hummed with deadly power. The girl felt it too. She shivered, clutching her blanket tighter. Her glowing eyes brimmed with terror. She whispered something over and over, the same word, her voice breaking each time. Thomas didn't need to understand the language. He knew it meant, "They're here." The soldiers spread out in lines, scanning the ground, sweeping the area. Dogs, or something like dogs, leapt from the ships, their jaws lined with steel, their eyes burning red. They sniffed the mud, the air, the broken tracks of the storm. Thomas's blood ran cold. They were tracking her. He slammed the barn door shut, his hand shaking. His mind screamed at him to run, to hide, to save himself. But then he looked at her, broken, scarred, afraid, and he knew there was no choice. He could not hand her over. "Stay," he whispered firmly, pointing at her. "Quiet." She looked at him, her glowing eyes wide. She wanted to argue, but she was too weak, too broken. She nodded slowly. Thomas grabbed an old pitchfork from the wall. It was a useless weapon against men with rifles and armor, but it gave him something to hold, something to make him feel less helpless. He stood by the barn doors, listening. The sound of boots drew closer, heavy, countless, marching in unison. Then came voices, cold and sharp. "Search every building. She is here." Thomas's heart pounded. He pressed his back against the wall, his pitchfork ready, though he knew it would do nothing. The barn doors shuddered as fists pounded against them. "Open up," a soldier barked. Thomas swallowed hard. His throat was dry. He thought of lying again, of saying the barn was empty. But this time there were too many. This time they would not just look. They would tear everything apart. The doors burst open with a crash before he could answer. Soldiers stormed in, their searchlights cutting through the shadows, beams of blue crawling over the hay, the walls, the stalls. Thomas gripped his pitchfork tighter, stepping forward. "This is private land," he said, forcing his voice steady. "You've no right here." The lead soldier turned toward him, visor glowing bright. "Step aside, human." His voice was mechanical, inhuman. "We seek a fugitive." Thomas's chest tightened. "No fugitive here. Only me." The soldier tilted his head as if amused. He gestured to the others. "Search." The soldiers spread out, kicking hay, smashing barrels, tearing through the barn with cruel efficiency. Thomas's heart raced as two soldiers drew closer to the far corner, closer to where she was hidden under the blanket and straw. He had seconds. "Hey!" Thomas shouted, stepping forward. His voice echoed through the barn. Every soldier turned their lights on him. His chest tightened under the weight of their glare, but he forced himself to stand tall. "This is my barn, my home. You break it, you pay for it. You've no business here." The lead soldier stalked toward him. His armored boots thudded on the wood. He stopped inches from Thomas, towering above him. "You lie," the soldier hissed. "Your kind always lies." Thomas's heart hammered. He could feel the soldier's weapon humming at his side, smell the ozone of its strange power. One pull of the trigger and Thomas would be nothing but ash. But then something strange happened. A faint flicker of light pulsed from the corner of the barn. Barely visible, almost hidden, the girl's power. It sparked weakly like a dying flame, but it was enough. One of the soldiers turned suddenly, distracted by the flicker. His light swept across an empty stall away from her hiding place. Thomas seized the moment. He stepped closer to the lead soldier, meeting his glowing visor with steady eyes. "Check all you want," he said, his voice hard. "You'll find nothing." There was a long silence. Then the soldier growled, "Nothing here." He signaled to his men. Reluctantly, they pulled back, though one lingered, his visor glowing as if suspicious. Finally, they left the barn, boots pounding against the wet ground as they regrouped outside. Thomas collapsed against the wall, his body shaking. He pulled the hay aside. The girl crawled out, trembling, her eyes wide. She looked at him with something new now. Not just fear, not just trust. Something stronger. For the first time, her weak voice formed a word clear enough for him to understand. She whispered, "Friend." Thomas stared at her, his heart heavy but steady. He had lied, fought, and nearly died for her. And now he knew the hunters would not stop. They would come again in greater numbers until she was theirs. And he had just made himself their enemy. The barn was silent after the soldiers left. But Thomas knew silence could be as dangerous as noise. His hands still trembled from the encounter. He leaned against the wooden beam, staring at the alien girl as she crawled out from her hiding place. Her glowing eyes were wide, shimmering with fear, but there was something else in them now, something warmer. She had called him friend. The word echoed in his mind, simple yet heavy. He had lived years in loneliness, speaking to no one but himself and the land. And now, in the middle of danger, a broken alien child of the stars had given him a word he thought he'd never hear again. The girl pulled the blanket tighter around herself and struggled to her feet. Her legs wobbled, her wound slowing her, but she stood anyway. Thomas moved quickly to steady her. She leaned into him for a moment, her small frame trembling before pulling away. She pointed at the door, at the fields beyond, then shook her head sharply. "They'll come back," Thomas murmured, understanding without words. He nodded. "I know." She hesitated, then raised one glowing hand. Her eyes narrowed in concentration. At first nothing happened. Then faint sparks of light danced across her fingertips, weak and flickering, like fireflies struggling to live. Thomas watched, astonished, but then the sparks grew. Thin streams of energy stretched between her fingers, humming softly, bending the air itself. She groaned, her body trembling under the strain, but the sparks formed into a glowing sphere of light hovering in her palm. Thomas stepped back, shielding his eyes. The light filled the barn, bright and strange, throwing shadows against the walls. For a moment, the place felt alive with alien power. Then the sphere flickered and collapsed, vanishing into smoke. The girl stumbled forward, nearly collapsing. Thomas caught her before she hit the ground. Her body shook violently, sweat dripping down her pale face. She looked up at him with weary eyes, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Weak. Broken." Thomas shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "Not broken." He held her steady until her legs stopped trembling. She leaned against him, breathing hard, but there was gratitude in her glowing eyes. For the next hour, Thomas worked to hide any sign of her presence. He closed the barn doors tighter, stacked barrels against the walls, and spread fresh hay to cover her footprints. She watched him silently, her eyes following his every move. At last she crawled closer, touching his arm. She pointed at him, then pressed her hand against her chest. "Safe," she whispered again. Then she tried to say his name, stumbling over the human word. "Tito, Mass." He froze, his heart tightening. Hearing his name in her voice, fragile, broken yet determined, was like hearing life return to a place he thought dead. He gave a faint smile and nodded. "Yes, Thomas." For the first time she smiled too. It was small, almost hidden, but real. The moment did not last. Outside, a deep rumble shook the ground. Thomas ran to the crack in the barn wall and peered through. His blood turned to ice. More ships, larger, heavier, landing at the edge of the village. Dozens of soldiers poured out, their black armor shining under the gray sky. The girl staggered to the wall beside him, her glowing eyes wide with dread. She pressed her hand against the wood, whispering something in her own tongue. Her voice trembled like a prayer. Thomas grabbed her shoulder gently. "We can't run," he said softly. "Not yet. You're too weak." He pointed at the hay. "Hide." But this time she shook her head. Slowly, painfully, she raised her hands. Sparks flickered again, brighter than before. The air crackled with strange energy, and Thomas felt the hair on his arms stand on end. Her eyes burned with faint light as she looked at him. She whispered a single word, one he could understand. "Fight!" Thomas stared at her. She was broken, hunted, almost destroyed, yet she still wanted to fight. His chest filled with a strange mix of fear and admiration. He placed his rough hand over her glowing one. "Not alone," he said firmly. The energy sparked between them, humming softly. For the first time, she did not flinch from his touch. For the first time, she let him share the glow. Outside, the rumble of soldiers grew louder. Boots struck the mud, engines roared, and the village bells rang an alarm. The hunters were coming, stronger than before, determined to find their prize. Inside the barn, a bond had been forged. Human and alien, farmer and fugitive, two broken souls standing together. Thomas gripped his pitchfork, his jaw tight. She stood beside him, her glow flickering weakly but steadily. Their enemies thought she was alone, weak. Easy prey, they were wrong. The hunters had no idea what had just been born in that barn. Trust, courage, and a dangerous promise. The village was no longer quiet. Bells rang an alarm, dogs barked wildly, and the heavy roar of ships filled the sky. Thomas stood at the barn door, his grip tight around the old pitchfork, staring at the dark swarm of soldiers moving across the fields. They came in waves, black armor glinting under the pale light, weapons humming with energy. There were too many this time. The girl stood beside him, her thin body trembling but her glowing eyes steady. She had no strength left to run far, yet there was no fear in her face now, only resolve. She touched his arm and whispered one word again. "Fight." Thomas's heart twisted. Fight? Against these soldiers? It was madness. He was a farmer, not a soldier. He had no gun, no army, no shield. A single strike from their strange weapons would end him. And yet, he could not forget her scars, her chains, her broken voice begging for safety. She had trusted him. She had called him friend, but the choice weighed heavy. If he kept her here, the soldiers would kill him too. If he turned her over, they might spare his life. All he had to do was step aside, point to the barn, and say the truth. She's here. He would live. His land would remain, and no one would ever know. The thought burned him like fire. Live at the cost of betrayal, or die protecting her. The girl seemed to read the battle inside him. She shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with sorrow. She touched her chest, then pointed toward the door as if saying, "I'll go. I'll leave. Save yourself." Thomas grabbed her wrist gently. "No," he said firmly. His voice shook, but his eyes were steady. "Not without you." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning. Her glowing eyes widened, and for a moment she looked at him not with fear, but with awe. Outside, the soldiers drew closer. Their leader barked orders, his mechanical voice echoing through the air. "Surround the structures. Leave nothing standing. The fugitive must be taken, alive if possible. Dead if not." Thomas's blood ran cold. He knew then, if they caught her, they wouldn't just kill her. They would drag her back to chains, to torment, to endless suffering. He could not allow it. He turned back to the barn, his mind racing. There was no winning a battle against so many, but maybe there was a way to stall them, to buy time. He pushed barrels and crates against the doors, forming a crude barricade. The girl watched, confusion flickering in her glowing eyes, until she understood. He was not giving her up. He was preparing to stand. Her hands trembled as she raised them again, sparks flickering between her fingers. The air filled with a faint hum, the same strange energy Thomas had seen before. She groaned in pain, her body straining, but she pushed herself harder. A thin shield of light formed between them and the doors, glowing faintly like a fragile wall. Thomas stared at it in wonder. "You can protect us," he whispered. She gave him a faint, tired nod, but her eyes told the truth. She couldn't hold it for long. The ground shook as heavy boots marched closer. Shadows stretched against the barn wall. The dogs snarled, their mechanical growls echoing. Thomas's chest tightened. This was it. The choice had been made. There was no turning back. He stood beside her, pitchfork in hand, staring at the door as it rattled with the force of soldiers outside. His heart pounded like a drum, but his fear turned to fire. If this was the end, then he would meet it standing, not kneeling. The girl looked at him one last time. her glowing eyes shimmering with emotion he couldn't name. She whispered his name, soft, broken, but clear. "Thomas!" The doors shook violently. A voice roared from outside. "Last chance, farmer. Give her up or burn with her." Thomas's grip tightened on the pitchfork. He drew in a deep breath, his voice hard as iron. "Then burn." The soldiers rammed the doors. Wood splintered, the barricade cracked, and the shield of light flickered under the pressure. Sparks rained across the barn as the girl cried out, pouring everything she had into keeping it alive. Thomas planted his feet beside her. He could smell the smoke of burning engines, hear the hum of deadly weapons, feel the weight of the enemy pressing. Closer. This was the choice he had made. He would not give her up. He would stand. He would fight. And whatever came next, life or death, he would face it with her at his side. The barn doors shook under the soldiers' blows, each strike louder than thunder. Wood splintered. Hay fell from the rafters and dust filled the air. Thomas stood shoulder to shoulder with the alien girl, gripping his old pitchfork like a weapon of war. His heart pounded, but he did not step back. The girl trembled beside him, her glowing eyes burning with both fear and determination. Sparks of light danced across her hands, forming a thin, flickering shield between them and the door. Every strike from outside cracked it, and every time it reformed weaker than before. She was breaking, but she would not stop. "Hold on," Thomas whispered, his voice steady, though fear clawed at him. "We'll face them together." The final blow came. The doors burst open, crashing inward. Soldiers stormed inside, their black armor shining, weapons humming with lethal energy. Red-eyed hounds growled, jaws snapping with steel teeth. The barn filled with light and noise, death rushing in like a flood. The girl cried out, raising her hands high. Her shield flared bright, filling the barn with a blinding glow. The first volley of gunfire struck it, sparking against the barrier. But the impact shook her to the core. She stumbled, gasping, her body straining under the force. Thomas roared and charged forward, swinging his pitchfork with all his strength. He drove it into the chest of the nearest soldier. The metal bent against the armor, but the force knocked the soldier back. Thomas swung again, wild and desperate, keeping them away from her. The soldiers laughed, their cold mechanical voices mocking him. "A farmer with a stick," one hissed. Pathetic, but Thomas didn't stop. Each swing, each shout was a promise. He would not surrender her. Behind him, the girl collapsed to her knees. Her shield shattered, sparks scattering into the air like dying stars. Soldiers raised their weapons, ready to fire. And then, something changed. The girl screamed. Not a scream of fear, but of fury, of pain, of defiance. Her glowing lines burned brighter than ever before, spreading across her body like rivers of fire. Light exploded from her hands, blasting through the barn, knocking soldiers off their feet. The hounds howled and scattered, their steel bodies smoldering from the heat. Thomas shielded his eyes, stunned. The broken, fragile girl he had found in his barn was no longer weak. She was power itself unleashed. The soldiers tried to regroup, but her energy swept through them like a storm. Their weapons melted in their hands, their armor cracked and split. One by one they fell, blinded and burned by her light. Thomas staggered back, staring in awe. She rose to her feet, glowing like a star, her voice echoing in the air. He didn't understand the words she spoke, but the power in them shook the very ground. The leader of the soldiers stepped forward, his visor burning bright. "You cannot escape us," he growled. "You are property. You belong to us." The girl's glowing eyes narrowed. She raised her hands high, and for a moment the barn seemed too small to contain her. She unleashed a blast of energy so fierce that the leader was thrown back, his armor shattering into pieces. His scream was swallowed by the light. When the glow finally faded, silence fell. The barn was broken, smoke rising from shattered beams. Soldiers lay scattered on the ground, some fleeing into the fields, others too weak to move. The hounds were gone, the ships retreating into the sky like frightened birds. The girl stood in the center, her body trembling, her glow fading. She had given everything. Her knees buckled and she began to fall. Thomas dropped his pitchfork and caught her before she hit the ground. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes dim. She looked up at him weakly, whispering, "Safe, because of you." Tears stung Thomas's eyes. "No," he said softly. "Safe because of us." He carried her out of the barn, stepping into the golden light of dawn. The village stood in shock, people gathering at the edge of the fields. They had seen it all, the fight, the power, the bond between human and alien. No one spoke. No one dared. Years later, the story would be told across worlds, of a farmer who chose kindness over fear, of an alien girl who found hope in a stranger's barn, of how, on that night, a friendship sparked a future no one could have imagined. It was the story of how humanity's heart and an alien strength stood together against the darkness. And it was only the beginning.